Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time, Masechet Chagigah. This is our third lesson in this Masechet, and today we're going to be reviewing Daf 14 through 20. Very exciting. We are going to be finishing the Masechet next week, if you could believe it. Not only will we be finishing the Masechet, but we are going to be finishing all of Seder Moed. So those of you who have been following, if you started from the beginning of the cycle of Daf Yomi 2 and a few months ago, 2 years and a few months ago, we started with Masechet Brachot, and then we moved on to Masechet Shabbat. That was the beginning of Seder Moed, right? There are 6 sections, 6 books of Mishnah. Brachot is in Zraim. It's the only Gemara that we have in Masechet Zraim, in Seder Zraim. Shabbat we've been dealing with for almost exactly 2 years. So next week, Be'ezrat Hashem, not only will we be finishing Masechet Chagigah, but we will be finishing all of Moed. And that means that afterwards, meaning the week later, we'll be starting not only a new Masechet, which is Masechet Yevamot, we will also be starting a new Seder, meaning we're going to be starting the Seder of Nashim, where we discuss, I guess one can call it women's issues, laws that pertain to women. So that will be a journey that we will take together. And that starts in 2 weeks. So again, next week we will be finishing Masechet Chagigah together. The following week we will be starting Masechet Yevamot. Okay, so let's begin. Daf 14, we're a few lines down, and we were talking about angels. If you remember last week, we started talking about what's called Ma'aseh Merkava. Ma'aseh Merkava literally means the happening of the chariot. Merkava means a chariot. But as we saw last week, it really discusses, I guess, what we would call the structure of the spiritual world, the heavens, the angels. So Daf 14 continues talking about angels and how angels are created every day, and that they praise God every day. And from here we get to a discussion about God. The Gemara tells us on Daf 14, right? God has black hair, or let me rephrase. It's important to understand that when we mention these images, we don't mean them in a literal sense, right? Meaning, I don't think anybody believes God has black hair or white hair. Rather, God has revealed himself, or the images of God has been seen by, let's say, different prophets in different ways. So the Gemara explains this is not a contradiction, right? When God goes out to war, then you'll see him with black hair. When he's sitting and learning, you'll see him with white hair. So again, I think that this is a very deep concept. I think it's not meant to be seen, again, superficially, but I think there's this idea of youth and vigor. When we see God coming out to help us in war, we understand the value of age and wisdom when we're talking about learning. So I think that's the idea. Here again, there's an image of God's throne. It seems that next to God's throne is another throne, and that is the throne for David, for King David. Again, the idea of putting the king, right, David, so high up in the hierarchy of spirituality is a very powerful message, right? Or maybe there are 2 thrones there. One is for compassion, right, chesed, or tzedakah, and the other is for din, right? We talk about this, we learned about it in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, and when we talk about in the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah, we always ask God, right, to get up from his throne of justice, of letter of the law, justice, and we want him to sit on the throne of compassion. So maybe those are the two thrones, or maybe it's God has one throne and one footstool. So again, an image of God in the heavens. From here, God talks about Yeshayahu again, who is the prophet, and says that he cursed the Jewish people with 18 things, right? Again, not because he wanted to curse the people, rather they were doing bad things, and therefore bad things will happen to them during the destruction of the temple. And from here, the Gemara tells us that 18 people will be removed from the nation, and in the destruction, in the destructive process. And oh, okay, sorry. I hope everybody's okay. And the what's going to happen during the destruction of the temple? The youth will dominate over the elders. Again, we said elders are wise. Youth tend to be, I would say, maybe too spontaneous to rule. But there will always be faithful people, right? The Gemara tells us that even though we have a description of a terrible time period of the destruction of the temple, we should realize that there will always be faithful people around. And they, so they used to approach the sages and ask them to teach them Torah. And the person always said, no, I don't know enough Torah. I can't really teach you. And the Gemara says the fact that they're not willing to teach shows that they're very honest about their learning. But again, these people, even though they're learned, were not very good or not very just in their business dealings. Again, we're talking about the destruction of the temple. And in the time of the destruction, people are really right, dishonest and not kind. Again, we're talking about the destruction. Here it seems the destruction of the second temple could be also in the first. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when talking about this idea of Merkava, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai got off of his donkey to hear about these very divine spiritual concepts from his students. And when this happened, a fire came out and surrounded them, and the trees began to praise God. And we see really when and we mentioned this last week, the maybe the fear or the danger of discussing these very spiritual topics is that we're afraid, right, that you'll get too close or get too caught up. We're going to get into a very famous story in a few minutes. So here you see that when they're discussing these topics, a fire came out and protected them, and everything around, like the nature, praised God. And Rabbi Yochanan praises his student because we see that he's using his knowledge of these spiritual ideas in a very positive way. Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Yossi HaKohen also expounded these concepts of Maaseh Merkava, and the sky became cloudy, and a rainbow came out, and angels gathered around them. And again, Rabbi Yochanan has a dream about these students that they were actually at Har Sinai, at the right Mount Sinai, right, meaning that they're really getting revelation. The Breita says that this Maaseh Merkava was expounded 3 times in a good way, right? Other times it seems it was not necessarily in a positive way. From here, the bottom of 14 describes, I think, a very famous Talmudic story, which is 4 people going into the Pardes. In Hebrew, right? Arba nichnasu la Pardes. They go into an orchard. Here, it does not mean that they walked into an apple orchard. It is figurative. There are different ways to understand what this orchard is. One is that they entered a mystical realm. Again, since we're talking about mysticism or spirituality, so one is that they entered the spiritual realm. Another suggestion is maybe it was the Garden of Eden. Another is that they were learning Torah on there are four ways to learn Torah. There are four levels. I should go this way, right? Pardes stands for pshat, which means the literal meaning of the words. Remez, which is like, what is it hinting at? Dalit is drash, right? How do we expound it even deeper? And samech means sod, which is the hidden secrets of the Torah. And here it seems that they went very deep into their learning so far that we'll see what happens, right? So there are four scholars, four sages, Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, we'll talk about him in a minute, and Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara tells us at the bottom of 14, Ben Azai died because the experience was so overwhelming that he couldn't handle it. So he died. Ben Zoma went crazy. Again, couldn't handle the experience. It was so intense that he literally lost his mind. Acher, whose real name was Elisha ben Avuya, we'll talk about him in a minute. He becomes a heretic, and therefore we when we mention him, we actually call him Acher, the other one, meaning to not mention his name because the rabbis are so I don't want to use the word traumatized, but so disheartened by the fact that such a great sage became a heretic. And the last is Rabbi Akiva. He's the only one that came out safely. Again, I use the word came out in a figurative sense, not in a literal sense. So here the Gemara talks about who each of these people are, right? There are halachic statements by Ben Zoma, meaning Ben Zoma was a great scholar, but he contemplated these very deep, again, spiritual or mystical ideas that he couldn't handle it, and he died. Acher, the Gemara asks, what made him go off the path, right? What made him become a heretic? He actually saw an angel and thought that maybe there were, right? So he, again, is entering this mystical realm. He sees an angel there, and the Gemara says that he thought or assumed that maybe there are two divine authorities, right? God and this angel. And that made him question the unity of God. And that is what led to I guess his not only questioning but really leaving the faith completely. It says that when he came to this, there isn't one God. A voice came out from heaven and said, everybody can do tshuva, can repent, except for Elisha ben Avuya. And when he heard this, he decides that that's it. I'm out of here, and I am going to devote myself to enjoying this world. And he basically goes to a prostitute, and the prostitute says, who is this? And he said, he must be someone else. And that's where we get the name Acher, right? She basically gives him a new name, meaning he's someone else. And he basically said, right, everything has two aspects, right? Good and bad, or right, heaven and hell, or maybe like everybody gets a double portion. And he tries, again, here Rabbi Meir was a student of Elisha ben Avuya, of Acher. It was very difficult for Rabbi Meir. He tries to get his teacher to do tshuva, but he said, I heard in Shamayim, in heaven, that I cannot do tshuva, so I'm not going to. And the Gemara now gives us a very dramatic story of Rabbi Meir, who wants to learn from his teacher. but his teacher is no longer a right, faith-abiding Jew, right? He does not believe in God. He has completely left the religion. But Rabbi Meir knows that there's so much knowledge in Acher. So the Gemara says that Acher used to ride his horse on Shabbat. Again, he doesn't keep Shabbat. And Rabbi Meir would walk behind him in order to learn Torah from him. And when they got to the outskirts of the city, right out, remember we learned about Tchum. When he gets to the limit of the city where you're not allowed to go past on Shabbos, Acher would say to him, Meir, you need to go back now because you can't go any further. Meaning there was such respect one to the other. And again, right, Rabbi Meir's trying to get him to come back or go back, but Acher does not. So they actually used to enter the study hall, the yeshiva, and they would ask children what they were learning. And they used to take these verses as a sign, right? Whatever the children were learning that day must have been, purposeful, as a sign for them. So they actually went to 13 different synagogues. And every time they asked the children, the verse that they came up with was all about hopelessness of the wicked. And therefore, Acher feels helpless and hopeless. And some say, now there's a difference of opinion what the end of the story is. Either it's sad or it's really sad, right? Some say that he had a knife and basically he cut this last child into pieces. Or no, we wouldn't believe that he would do that. Rather, he had a knife. He cut the Sefer Torah into pieces. Again, still very dramatic. Or he didn't have a knife. It meant if he would have had a knife, he would have cut all these, he would have caused damage, right? That's how upset he was. When Acher died, they didn't want him in Gan Eden or in Gehenom, right? Again, I think describe the conflict, right? Meaning this was a great rabbi who for many years was such a positive influence, and at the end, right, leaves Judaism. And what do we do with that, right? How do we reconcile that? What do we do? So the Gemara says that, right, they didn't want him in heaven and they didn't want him in hell, right? Because he doesn't deserve to go to heaven, but he doesn't deserve to go to hell because he was such a great person. Rabbi Meir prayed that actually he would go to hell, and then, right, that would purify his soul so that he can get to Gan Eden, right, to heaven. And smoke rose out of the grave to show that this actually happened. And when Rabbi Yochanan died, he went to Gehenom to pull him out, right, and take him up to heaven. The daughter of Acher asked Rebbe to support her, right? She said, remember the Torah that my father learned beforehand and not the deeds that he did at the end of his life. And fire came down and singed Rebbe, meaning to show him that he needed to support her. So here the Gemara actually says on Daf 15, right? A mature person can take from a flawed person, right? We take the good and we leave the bad. I think it's just a very interesting discussion in terms of what do we do with his Torah, with all of his teaching, right? We do not get rid of his teachings. However, we don't name him by name, right? We say Acher. The Gemara says that if a sage is fearful of God, right, a God-fearing Jew, as we say, then he learns Torah, so that Torah will protect him from bad deeds, which again I think is an interesting perspective. Now let's go to Rabbi Akiva, right? Daf 16 tells us that the angels wanted to push Rabbi Akiva out, and God stopped them, right? And Rabbi Akiva basically expounded several verses in the Pardes, right, while in this mystical journey, and he was able to recognize the place of God, but he didn't go too far, meaning he went in, but not all the way, maybe. From here, since we're talking again about the heavenly world, the Gemara talks about demons. So yes, the Gemara definitely believes that there's such thing as demons. As we saw, there's definitely such thing as angels. How you understand this, I think, is up to you, right? Do you take it literally? Do you take it figuratively? I definitely think that in Masechet Shabbat, when we learned a lot about the dangers of demons lurking in the shadows or in the bathroom, I really feel like we're talking about bacteria, right? Like things that cause bad harm to humans that we don't see, right? So I don't think it's red figures that have wings and horns. I don't necessarily think that that's what it is. But again, interestingly, here the Gemara tells us that demons are like angels in three ways, and like people in three ways. They're like angels in the sense that they do have wings, so I take that back, and that they fly, and that they know the future. The Gemara tells us they don't really know the future, but they hear God talking about the future, so they can overhear it, and they know what's going to happen. How are they like people? Demons actually eat and drink, and they reproduce, and they can die. So that's, again, interesting. How you interpret that, I think, is up to you. And now I think more interesting for me is the next idea, which is people. Right? People are like angels and like animals. What does that mean? Again, right? Human beings have a spiritual side and a physical side, right? So the Gemara tells us, how are we like angels? We have da'at, meaning we have cognitive abilities, intellectual abilities. We walk erect, right? Like the angels, and we speak in Hebrew, which I think is a beautiful idea. That is an angelic quality. Animals, how are we like animals? Again, we eat and drink, we reproduce, and we eliminate our waste. So I think that that's a very powerful statement, right? I think that we need to embrace our angelic side, right? Recognize that we have maybe animalistic urges, and that's okay, meaning that's the way God created us. But I think the other side of us is also equally, if not much more important, which is the spiritual side or the angelic side. Again, this idea of using our intellect, I think, to understand higher concepts. Again, maybe what does it mean to walk erect? I think it might mean, to stand tall, to stand proud, to do things for others. And to speak in Hebrew, I think, is, again, to connect to the Torah, to tefillah, to prayer. So again, I think there's a lot here, as usual. Okay, the Gemara now says, if you remember, we said the Mishnah last week, you shouldn't ask what came before creation, right? Those are things that are too mystical. We're not allowed to we're not allowed to ask what happened before creation. So, and from here, the Gemara talks about the Mishnah had said you shouldn't look at the rainbow or contemplate the rainbow. So the Gemara says, why? Why can't you look at a rainbow? It says that it's like looking at God, right? Again, if you remember how rainbows came into creation, right after the flood in the time of Noah, right? God brings the rainbow as a symbol of the covenant that he makes with us, that he's never going to destroy the world. So here the Gemara says, right, that the rainbow is divine, and therefore you shouldn't gaze at the rainbow too long, because that's not appropriate. And here the Gemara talks about sinning, right? Again, this idea that if God is everywhere, so the Gemara says that if you sin, if you transgress in private, that's almost worse, because you think that God can't see you right, in private, in your house, in your wherever, right, in a private domain. And the Gemara says that's even worse, right? You think God can't see you, right? Therefore, right, you shouldn't do that. And if you can't control yourself, so then, interestingly, the Gemara says, right, you should go somewhere else and be very discreet. Back to the rainbow, right? The Gemara says that if you glare at the rainbow or at the Nasi, at the leader of the Jewish people, again, the Nasi is seen as a I guess a representative of God, or the Kohanim, right? The priests, when they give the blessing, right? This might be one of the sources that when the priests give their blessing in the synagogue, right? We actually either close our eyes or look down. I'll just say, like growing up, we used to turn around. And then at a certain point, the rabbi actually stood up and said, don't turn around. Right, turning around is giving your back to the priest. That's very disrespectful, right? So you should, and I think it's still the practice in many synagogues. So here's just a plug that when you have the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessings, please don't turn around, but either close your eyes or look down. Again, we're not supposed to look at them directly. Again, here it seems that it's you're looking at God, and if you do, your eyes will become dim, says the Gemara. Okay, the next Mishnah is we're going to talk more about the sacrifices that were brought during the festival, and here we're going to talk about the concept of smicha. Smicha means to lean, lismoch, means to lean. I guess interesting if you're thinking about the idea of like a rabbi gets smicha. Why is it called smicha? Because originally his teacher would put his hands on his head and kind of lean in to kind of transfer that responsibility to him or enjoin him to take on the responsibility of leadership. So here we're talking about smicha in terms of leaning on the animal. And when you do that, you are confessing your sins, and then you bring the sacrifice. So the Mishnah tells us on Daf 16 that you cannot do smicha on the festival, on Yom Tov, because leaning on the animal is like riding the animal. And if you remember, we learned you're not allowed to ride an animal not on Shabbat nor on the festival. Or there's another opinion that no, you can do smicha on Yom Tov, and we're going to try to understand how, why some say yes and why some say no. Interestingly enough, Tosfot on this daf says that this is actually the first machloket, the first dispute that is written in the Talmud, and this actually is a dispute during the temple, right? That makes sense because the temple is standing, and we need to know: can you bring the sacrifice on the festival or not? And from here, the Gemara talks about different machlokot, right? Different people who have disagreed with one another, and throughout the generations, right? Again, those of you who've been learning Gemara for a while, right? There's pretty much not one page of the Gemara without a difference of opinion. So we know that there are machlokot, right? Differences throughout the generations. And interesting, the Gemara says that in all the 5 generations of this particular machloket, in every generation, it's usually who's arguing with who. It's the Nasi, right, the leader, I would say the political leader, versus the Av Beit Din, what you would call maybe the Supreme Court justice, right? Meaning it's the basically the 2 greatest leaders of the time, one political, one learned or halachic, but again, both are learned. They're the ones that are arguing. The Gemara tells us that that hold on one second. That we have to take rabbinic law very seriously. And we see that with smicha, that even this concept of smicha is dirabanan. It's a rabbinic commandment. And you see that everyone is still arguing over it, right? So if they argue over a dirabanan, again, not to take away from a rabbinic law, but it's not a biblical law, and they're still arguing about it throughout the generations, we see how important it is to take the Jewish law seriously. The Gemara talks about, so now we talked about leaning, right? So what does it mean to do smicha? One opinion is that you have to lean with all of your strength. Right, so then I can understand why it would be prohibited on the festival, because that's really like riding, right? Instead of riding, like leaning on the animal or sitting on the animal on top, you're leaning on the side or on the front of the animal. So here the Gemara talks about men doing smicha and women that women don't need to do it, meaning they are not obligated to do it. However, if a woman wants to, she can. And this is a very interesting discussion about commandments that women are exempt from. Are they allowed to do them if they want to? And here the Gemara seems to support that idea that women, even if you are exempt, we are exempt, we are allowed to do those mitzvot. And here there's a story of women doing smicha, and the Gemara says, why is it allowed? To give them nachat ruach. What does nachat ruach mean? Maybe inner satisfaction, right? It makes them feel good. Again, I don't think that it's meant to be in a superficial way. I think it's meant to be taken in a deep way, right? It gives them deep meaning to do this. Another opinion at the bottom of 16 is that you do not have to fully lean on the animal. And then the question is, did the women actually lean fully or not, right? Did they really do smicha, or maybe they just did partial smicha? And here the Gemara talks about using the side of the animal versus the top, right, the head. Right, so the Gemara says you can't use the side of the animal on Shabbat or Yom Tov, and therefore, again, smicha is generally done on the side, and therefore you can't do smicha. Or maybe you can use the side of the animal, but not the head, and then maybe smicha has to be done by the head, and that's why you can't do it. The next Mishnah at the top of 17 tells us that, again, there's a machloket, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai tell us that you can bring the shlamim, the peace offering, on Yom Tov, on the festival, because you're going to eat from that sacrifice. Again, the shlamim, the peace offering, was given, some parts of it were given to, again, to the altar, to the priest, but most of it was taken home. Like that was your barbecue for the meal. And the Rav and Beit Shammai say you can bring it on the festival, but you cannot do smicha on it. But you cannot bring the olah, right? The olah is the burnt offering. It's burnt completely. And because you're not going to partake from it, you cannot bring that offering on the festival. Actually do smicha the day before, right? So they say, right, let's say the festival is Tuesday night, Wednesday. So they say do smicha on Tuesday day when it's before the festival, and on Wednesday bring the sacrifice. They say that's fine. Beit Hillel say you can actually bring both sacrifices, meaning shlamim and olah, and you need to do smicha right before you bring the sacrifice, meaning Beit Hillel say there's no such thing as doing smicha, the day before. It comes together. You do smicha, you sacrifice the animal. Therefore, you do smicha on the festival and bring the sacrifice right then and there. From here, the Gemara talks about, the Mishnah is still talking, now it's talking about Shavuot. What if Shavuot falls out on Friday? So again, we just said that you can't bring the sacrifice on the festival, but the next day is Shabbat, and I can't bring the sacrifice then either. So do I have to wait 2 full days in order to bring the sacrifice? So Beit Shammai say that you bring the sacrifice on Sunday. Yes, you wait till Sunday. Beit Hillel say no, bring it on the festival itself. But if it falls out on Shabbat, so then you sacrifice it on Sunday, right? You are going to wait one more day and do it on Shabbat, right? So and if it falls out on, right, again, if Shavuot falls out on Shabbat, so we say you don't bring the sacrifice on Shabbat, you're bringing it on Sunday. Now, here, this is a fascinating, just historical idea. If you bring it on that Sunday, the Gemara says that you have to make sure that the priest does not wear his festival clothing, and you can even fast on that day, and you can do a eulogy on that day, because we want to make sure that you understand that that Sunday is not Shavuot. Why? Because at the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, we have the Tzdukim, right? The Sadducees. The Tzdukim, they believed in the written Torah, but not in the oral Torah. And therefore, what does it say after Pesach? It says, Usfartem lachem, you have to count, mimacharat haShabbat, after the Shabbat. Now, we understand, because we have the oral law, that it doesn't mean you start counting Sfirat HaOmer after Shabbat, meaning on Saturday night. That's not when we count. We say, what does it mean to start counting after Shabbat? It means start counting after the festival, meaning after Pesach. So therefore, if the first night of Pesach is Tuesday night, so Wednesday night, when you will, right, everyone outside of Israel have the second night of Pesach, you start counting Sfirat HaOmer. For us, it's after Pesach, right? It's not the festival anymore. I mean, we're still in the 7 days of Pesach, but it's not the festival anymore. We start counting that night. So now, what's the point? For the Tzdukim, it didn't matter when Pesach fell out. The Saturday night after Pesach, they would start counting Sfirat HaOmer. What does that mean? That if you count 49 days from Saturday night, every time, meaning every year, the Tzdukim would celebrate Shavuot Saturday night and Sunday. And therefore, if we bring the sacrifice on the Sunday, right, even though Shavuot was the day before, we need to make sure that everyone realizes it's not Shavuot, right? We're not like the Tzdukim. So that's just interesting historical fact. With halachic ramifications in the time of the temple. Okay, the Gemara tells us that Shavuot, again, interestingly, right, we know Pesach and Sukkot are 7/8 days. Shavuot is 1 day / 2 days for you, right? So Shavuot is 1 day. So can I bring a sacrifice after that 1 day? The Gemara says yes, right? Shavuot actually has makeup days, right? They're called Tashlumin for 7 days, just like Pesach and Sukkot, right? It's like, right, again, we call it the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 festivals. And therefore, we treat it in the same way, right? We compare all 3 together for different halachic practical applications. And therefore, we say that you have 7 days to bring your sacrifice for Shavuot. Or, as we mentioned before, machloket, or another opinion is no, there is no tashlumim. There's no makeup for Shavuot. You have to bring the sacrifice on that day. Again, as we said, or not, right? You have 7 days. As we said before, right, you count 49 days to get to Shavuot. And again, this seems to be a proof for the side that says Shavuot is 1 day, meaning we count 49 days, you get to day 50, that is Shavuot. There's no more, right? No less and no more. We talk about Shavuot being the festival at right at harvest time. And Sukkot at the top of 18. Sukkot is the festival of Chag HaKatzir, that's Shavuot, right? The harvest, as opposed to Sukkot, which is Chag HaAsif, right? The gathering, whatever's left in the field, is the gathering, right? And that is another name for Sukkot. Okay. From here, we have, what about, again, we mentioned the case of Shavuot on Shabbat. So we said the next day is a special day for sacrifices, but, right, we have to make sure and very clear that it is not Shavuot. And there's a story of a funeral that happens on this type of Sunday, and they didn't let them eulogize. And they said, wait a minute, but it's the day after Shavuot, but it's not a Sunday. So here it says, it's the day after Shavuot, it's not a Sunday, and therefore there are no eulogies on that day. If it was a Sunday, there would be a eulogy to show specifically that is not a day. Interesting, here in Israel, we have a custom that the day after Shavuot, right, we have something called Isru Chag, right? It's like the day after the Chag, and the kids are still off, just to get some bonus off time. Okay, from here till the end of the Masechet, we are going to be discussing the laws of purity and impurity, of Tuma and Tahara. And I have this chart for you that was made by Rabbi Natan Farber, who started Style a Daf. These are beautiful illustrations of the daf. Unfortunately, he stopped making them. I wish he would start again. But you can look him up if you want to see more. I did use his things for brachot and for Shabbat. He has a website and he's on Facebook and I don't know, but he's really excellent. This is going to show us, I think this is an excellent chart to show us the different levels of tum'ah, of purity. So the top of the pyramid is called Avi Avot, right? It means basically like the grandfather of impurity, and that is a dead body, meaning the most impure you can get is a dead body or a metal object that has touched a dead body. I think it's just important when we begin this conversation to understand that when we talk about purity and impurity, I am not speaking of something dirty versus clean. I think, unfortunately, that language was used in the past, right? Like, are you clean? It is not about cleanliness. It has nothing to do with being dirty. It is not negative. It really is about encountering death, as we see, right? The most severe tum'ah, impurity, is a dead body, right? Whenever we encounter death, it affects us, again, as mortals, as human beings, and therefore we have to go through a purification process. The more intense the impurity, the tum'ah, the more intense it is, the more intense the purification process. So we're going to talk a lot about that. I just want to go through the levels, right? Av HaTumah is something, someone that touches a dead body, or something that touches a dead body, or a dead sheret. A sheret is like a creepy crawly. There are 8 of them. So if you touch, or that object is an Av HaTumah, a father of Tumah. From there, you have what's called a Rishon, meaning first degree Tumah. That is a person, a utensil or food that touched the level above, right? And now it's going to be basically almost like, I see it as like contagious, right? You touch something, you get contaminated, ki'ilu, right? Not literally, but figuratively, right? So we have first degree. Second degree is food or liquid that touched the first degree. Again, once you get to people, I guess I would say the lowest level that a person can be is a first degree, a rishon. There's no such thing as a person being a sheni. Only food or utensils become a sheni. At a certain level, it's also important to understand that different things stop becoming or stop transmitting tuma, right? So a person cannot get more than a first. Or less, I guess we would say. Second degree tuma, we said, is food or liquid that touches a first degree, and then it stops for regular food. A third degree tuma, that's the green line. A third degree is right, a shlishi. That's something that is kadosh, right, sanctified, meaning a korban, or truma that touched a sheni, right? So and truma stops at third degree. The fourth degree is kodshim, right? Again, something that's sanctified that touched a shlishi, right? So basically, we have different levels, different things can pass on tuma. This is important, basically, for the rest of our masechet. So here we go. One second. Okay. The Mishnah tells us that you have to wash your hands when you eat food that is chulin. The word chulin means mundane, meaning regular food. And for maaser, we'll see maaser is a level above, meaning we have to treat it with more caution, let's say, or more sanctity. The next level is truma. And the next level is Kodesh, right? Again, Kodesh means sacrificial meat. For Kodesh, you need to immerse your hands. It's not enough to just wash your hands, but you have to immerse your hands in a mikvah. When touching the mei chatat means the water that has the ashes of the red heifer, of the para aduma. This is called mei chatat. It was used to sprinkle on people who were tameh met, meaning they were impure because they came in contact with a dead body. So if you touch that water, you must immerse your entire body, not just your hands, but your entire body. So we see here 5 levels of, I'll use the word, let's say, stringency in purification or purity versus impurity. If you only, the next part of the Mishnah says that if you only had intent to immerse yourself in a mikvah for chulin, meaning the lowest level, so then it doesn't work for the next level. Now, I just have to take a step back and recognize we don't live in a world where you go to the mikvah to eat food with purity. Nowadays, the only time we use a mikvah is when we talk about family purity, right? Taharat mishpacha. The things we're talking about now are only things that happened during the time of the temple. So it's just important to understand that these concepts are not necessarily concepts we're familiar with. So basically, you have to make sure that you have intent for the level that you are going to the mikvah for. It works for everything of a lower level, but it does not work for things on a higher level. From here, we talk about the clothing of different people. And here we see that different parts of the Jewish community were more careful about the world of Tuma and Tahara, about purity. So someone who is careful, you can trust his clothing and you can, let's say, wear it or borrow it. People who are less careful, you cannot borrow it if you want to be more careful, right? So I think it's just interesting to think about this world of purity in a different way. Okay, the Gemara tells us, wait a minute, why do I even need to wash my hands for chulin and maaser, right? It's not a very sanctified thing. It's regular food. Why do I have to wash it? There are different opinions if maybe it's about eating it versus touching it. If you touch it, you don't have to wash your hands. If you're eating it, you do. Maybe it's when you eat bread, right? And this is the source that we have to wash our hands before we eat bread, as opposed to eating fruit where you don't need to wash your hands. And here the Gemara talks about needing intent. Again, intent is going to be very important when discussing these concepts. Daf 19, has a very fascinating case of a person standing on the beach and a wave detaches and all the water falls on him and it's the exact amount of a mikvah. Is the person purified, right? And basically the point is, do you need intent or not? The Gemara says, well, maybe, right, either he wasn't looking at it and therefore you don't need intent, or he saw it coming, so he did have intent. So that's not going to, that is not going to help us in terms of intent. There's another story, there's another story of fruit falling into water and you put your hand into it. Again, do you mean to put your hand into it or not? Again, intent, do you have intent or not? What about, again, we talked about going to the mikvah for a certain level of purity. What about, can I change my mind? And if so, at what point? So the Gemara says that if you come out of the mikvah, you can decide which level you want. Or no, you need to have at least 1 foot still in the mikvah in order to change or determine what level you had. From here, it's just important to understand that a mikvah, the ritual bath, needs to have a certain amount of water, 40 se'ah, 40 cubits. The Gemara tells a great story about what if the mikvah has exactly 40 se'ah, and 2 people go into the mikvah, one right after the other. The first person is purified. The second person is not, because when the first person came out, he took out some of the water, right? You ultimately take water out when you leave the mikvah, and therefore the second person is not purified. However, if the first person's foot is still in the water, we view all the water on the person's body as if it's still in the mikvah, and that second person is still does become purified. And I actually, when I taught this daf, I taught it to a group of women, and one of them is a mikvah lady, and she said she actually had this case, and these things happen, and you never know, and it's really crazy, or not crazy, it's fascinating. What about, does the water, right, we talked about all the water being seen as coming down, right, figuratively into the mikvah. What about, do we see all the water coming up, right? What if the person went to the mikvah and his foot is still in the water, and now he has a little puddle on the top of his head, I don't know why, and you take a needle, can I immerse the needle into the puddle of the person's head? Again, you might be saying, why are you asking this question? Either it's a practical question. I don't want to put the needle into a big mikvah. If I put it onto your head, it's not going to get lost. Or we want to understand, what does it mean that the water is connected to the mikvah? How far does it go? The discussion does it only go down, right, like we said, or can it also go up? And that seems to be a machloket. It seems that the end of the conversation is it really only goes down and it does not go up. From here, Daf 20 talks about the differentiation of, again, Kodesh. And interestingly, in those times, people who were very careful took their chulin, meaning regular food, and they treated it like Kodesh, like sanctified food, because they wanted to be as stringent as possible. The question is, does that transform the food into sanctified food, or no, right? You're treating it in a certain way that doesn't change its essence. Daf 20 continues and talks about how much guarding you need to do for different things in order to be sure that they remain pure, right? Again, how do I know that my shirt didn't come in contact with a dead rat? I should hope it didn't. But again, in those days, maybe it did. How much do I have to guard all of these things? And the Gemara basically says that if we're talking about very stringent levels of sanctity and of purity, you need to be very careful and watch the item at all times, right? So if you lose sight of that item, we have to assume it became tameh. right? And the Gemara talks about different situations where if you didn't see what happened, then you have to assume the thing is tameh, again, for certain levels. For mundane things, it's not a problem. With that, we finish the second chapter, and we'll begin the Gemara of the Mishnah of the third chapter, and we're still remaining in the world of Tum'ah and Tahara, of purity and impurity. The Mishnah tells us, again, those last two levels were Truma. Again, to remind us, Truma is what we separate out from our produce and give to the priest, right? They're eating it, and they have to eat it with a certain level of purity, as opposed to Kadshim or Kodesh. That means sacrificial meat, basically, right? Or sacrificial food. Things that came, that were in the temple, you needed to be at the highest level of purity to eat that food. So here, the Gemara tells us that with Kodesh, it is more stringent than Truma, because with Truma, you can immerse one vessel within another into the mikvah, but for Kodesh, you cannot do it. It doesn't work. Here also, the outside or the inside of the vessel and the handle are three separate parts of a utensil when discussing Truma, but for Kodesh, we view it all as one unit. Again, we're going to be the most stringent when we get to Kodesh. Carrying something tameh, right? If you're carrying something tameh, you can also carry something that's Truma, but not Kodesh, right? That does not work. And again, as we said, clothing that is okay for people who are eating Truma is seen as tameh, as impure for people who are going to eat Kodesh. Truma is different than Kodesh. In this case, right, you can tie things together and immerse them for, for Truma, but for Kodesh, you have to untie them first. Again, the idea is that when there's a knot, that's called a chatzitza. It's a interposition. It's like something that blocks the water from getting to the entire object, right? So if there is a knot, the water is not going to get into all the parts of the string, and therefore, again, for Truma, it's okay because really maybe it'll all get wet. But for Kodesh, for sacrificial meat, you have to, right, the vessel must be, right, you have to untie everything. Must be immersed before using them for Kodesh, but not for Truma. Vessels, right, let's say you have a bowl of like 5 apples, right, if one of the apples becomes tameh, impure, so for Truma, we just see that apple as being tameh and everything else is okay. But for Kadshim, we view everything in the vessel becomes tameh. Again, we're going to be very stringent. In Kodesh, again, as we see here on the chart, right, the Kodesh can become a 4th level or 4th degree. Truma only a 3rd degree. And the second to last thing, you can have one hand that's tameh and one hand that's tahor, again, pure and impure when we're dealing with Truma. But for Kadshim, no, right? Like if one hand becomes impure, you actually have to immerse both hands when dealing with Kodesh. Last thing, you can eat dry food with tameh hands when we're dealing with Truma, but not with Kodesh. Sorry, one last thing at the top of 21, that a person who is what's called an onen, someone who loses an immediate relative, in that first day before they bury the relative, they need to immerse in the mikvah in order to eat Kodesh, but not for Truma. And with that, we finished our lesson for today. And next week, as I mentioned before, we will be finishing Masechet Chagigah. Again, more tuma and tahara, more purity and impurity. And I really hope you will all celebrate next week our siyum when we finish together. And I just want to wish everyone a Shavuot Tov and a Chodesh Tov, right? Rosh Chodesh Adar this week. So really wishing everyone a wonderful week and see you next week.